At 5:40 in the morning, 3 hours before her own wedding, Margaux Calloway ran barefoot through her father's house with a sealed letter in her hand, trying to reach the front door before anyone woke. She didn't make it. Her mother was already standing at the top of the stairs, arms folded, as if she'd been waiting there all night. She said 4 words. Margaux never told anyone, for the rest of her life, what those 4 words were. By 9 that morning, Margaux was married. The letter never left the house. 62 years later, an estate appraiser opened a drawer that hadn't been touched since that morning, and found the letter still sealed, along with something else no one was expecting to find beside it. Who was Margaux running to reach? What did her mother say that stopped her cold on a staircase, in her own wedding dress, with seconds left before dawn? And whose handwriting, beyond Margaux's own, was waiting in that drawer, 62 years later, for someone to finally read it? This is a story about 3 people who each decided, independently, that the kindest thing they could do for someone they loved was lie to them by omission, and none of them found out, until decades later, that the other 2 had made the exact same choice. Her name was Margaux Calloway. She was 24. In 72 hours, she would marry a man she had met 4 times, to save her father's company and settle a debt she wasn't permitted to know the size of. She was already in love with someone else. And the man she was marrying was not, as everyone believed, including her, nearly as indifferent to that fact as he pretended to be. Whitmore Calloway's shipping company was 3 years from insolvency, a fact known to exactly 4 people, one of whom was his daughter, not because he told her, but because she found the ledgers herself, in a drawer he thought was locked. Julian Ashworth, 29, arrived at the Calloway house that spring the way a buyer arrives at an inspection. He shook Margaux's hand. He asked her father about tonnage capacity and insurance liabilities for 11 minutes before he said a single word to her directly. "Your daughter's fond of literature, I understand," Julian said to Whitmore, not to Margaux, though she was sitting 3 feet away. "That's a fine quality in a wife. Doesn't interfere with anything." He signed the betrothal papers without reading the final page twice, the way a man signs something he has already decided is simply necessary, not something he wants. Margaux would spend the next 4 months believing exactly what he seemed to want her to believe, that Julian Ashworth was cold, transactional, and entirely uninterested in whether she loved him. It would take her 62 years to learn how wrong that reading was, and by then, it would be far too late to tell him so. That same spring, her father hired an archivist to restore the estate library before the wedding. Adrian Cole, 26, quiet, precise, recently back from London. Within 3 weeks, Margaux was finding reasons to sit in a room full of other people's old letters that had nothing to do with the letters themselves. Teresa Byrne, the appraiser who found the letter in 2024, started where any careful researcher starts, with the paper trail. Adrian Cole's employment ended 4 months early, the week of the wedding, with no reason recorded except a single line in Whitmore Calloway's hand, paid through October regardless. A man paid for work he no longer did. That isn't a firing. That's a severance, the kind you give someone you're asking to disappear quietly. Teresa found a second name pressed faintly into the wood beneath where the letter had rested for 62 years, E. Calloway. Margaux's mother. And in a separate box, a fragment that didn't fit anywhere yet, a short, unfinished note in a third hand entirely, tucked into the lining of the same drawer, so old the fold lines had nearly worn through. Teresa couldn't read most of it without risking the paper. But she could read the first line. "I have known for some time now, and I want you to hear." The sentence stopped there. Whoever started that note never finished it, or never had the chance to. Small details build a case that no single fact can. The wedding proceeded on schedule. Margaux's signature on the certificate is steady, the handwriting of someone who has stopped fighting a decision, not someone at peace with it. Household staff records show Eleanor Calloway personally overseeing the placement of a newly purchased writing desk in her daughter's bedroom, 3 days before a wedding with 400 guests, an odd task for a busy mother of the bride to insist on doing herself. And in Eleanor's own correspondence, a letter to her sister, dated 1938, 24 years before her daughter's wedding, describing, almost word for word, the identical ache, a man she loved, a marriage she didn't, and a decision she called the only sensible thing available to a woman in my position. Eleanor Calloway had lived this exact story once. Somehow, her daughter ended up living it again, and so, it would turn out, had the man Margaux married. In July, a storm trapped Margaux and Adrian in the library for 4 hours with no staff and no explanation needed for why they stayed. They read a 19th-century sea captain's letters to his wife, 300 pages, 11 months of separation per voyage, and argued gently about whether the wife had been a fool to wait for him. She wasn't waiting out of weakness, Margaux said. She was choosing it. Every single day, she was choosing it again. Adrian didn't answer for a long moment. That's the part that frightens me, he finally said. Not the waiting. The choosing. Choosing is so much harder to forgive yourself for, later, than just being unlucky. Neither of them was talking about the captain's wife anymore, and both of them knew it, and neither one reached across the table. In August, Adrian found Margaux alone in the half-restored ballroom after midnight, practicing the first dance she'd have with Julian in 6 weeks, counting steps out loud to an empty room. He didn't announce himself. He simply picked up the count where she'd lost it, from the doorway, until she turned around. "You're better at this than he'll ever notice," Adrian said. "That's not a compliment I'm allowed to want from you," she answered, and it was the closest either of them ever came to saying the actual sentence out loud. He crossed the room. He did not touch her. He only said, quietly, "I know," and stood there a moment longer than either of them could justify, before he left. On his last afternoon at the house, Adrian passed Margaux on the garden path with a trunk already loaded into a car behind him. He didn't stop walking. He didn't say goodbye. He only looked at her, 3 full seconds, no more, the kind of look that says everything a person has decided not to say out loud, and then he kept walking, because stopping would have meant starting a conversation neither of them could afford to finish. She went inside and wrote the letter that night. Here is the first reframe. The letter Margaux sealed the night before her wedding never reached anyone, not because she lost her nerve at dawn, but because her mother found it first. A housemaid's oral history, recorded decades later, places Eleanor Calloway alone in her daughter's room at 4 a.m. the morning of the wedding, nearly 20 minutes before Margaux woke to find the letter still sitting exactly where she'd left it, and decided, on her own, to try to run it to Adrian herself before the household stirred. She never knew her mother had already read it, resealed it, and returned it hours earlier. The staircase confrontation at the start of this story was not Eleanor stopping her daughter from sending a letter. It was Eleanor stopping her daughter from a mistake Eleanor had already, silently, prevented, twice, in 2 different ways, in the same 12 hours, without her daughter ever knowing there were 2 interventions instead of 1. The 4 words Margaux never repeated to anyone, for 62 years? Teresa found them, finally, in Eleanor's own diary, recovered from the same estate. "I did this too." The second reframe changes what this story is actually about, and it starts with the man everyone in this account, including Margaux herself, believed had never noticed anything at all. Teresa traced Adrian Cole's abrupt departure to Baltimore, where he resurfaced 8 months later with a research position at a maritime archive, funded by an anonymous benefactor. The routing records lead to a discretionary fund controlled by exactly one person, Julian Ashworth. The man who negotiated his own marriage like a shipping contract, who asked about tonnage before he asked his bride's name twice, who signed his betrothal papers without a flicker of visible feeling. That man had spent 8 months quietly ensuring the person his fiancée loved landed somewhere safe, interesting, and far enough away that no one would ever have to discuss why. The unfinished note Teresa found in the drawer's lining belongs to him. Restoration specialists were able to recover the rest of it, and it reads, in full. "I have known for some time now, and I want you to hear it from me rather than from anyone else. It changes nothing about how I intend to treat you. A marriage built to save a company doesn't have to be a marriage built on less than the truth. I only ask that you let me be kind to you anyway. I find I would like to be, whether or not you ever love me back the way I suspect you love someone else. He never gave it to her. He tucked it into the same drawer his father-in-law had just purchased, on the same week, without knowing his mother-in-law had already hidden a second secret 2 inches away from his own. Julian Ashworth's coldness was never indifference. It was a man deliberately withholding a warmth he was afraid would only make the truth harder for her to hear, choosing, like Eleanor and like Margaux herself, to protect someone through silence rather than confession. 3 people, 1 house, the same instinct, and not one of them ever discovered, while it could still have mattered, that the other 2 had made the identical choice. Margaux Calloway Ashworth is 92, widowed 11 years, when Teresa brings her both letters, hers to Adrian, and her late husband's, never given to her, on the same October afternoon in 2024. She reads her own words first, aloud, quietly, to no one in particular. I am not asking you to meet me because I want you to stop me. I am asking because in 3 days I will belong to a house that isn't yours, and I would like, once, to say the true thing out loud before I spend the rest of my life saying only the necessary ones. She sets it down. She is quiet for a long moment. Then Teresa hands her Julian's note, and reads him the line he never got to finish saying to her in 62 years of marriage. I only ask that you let me be kind to you anyway. Margaux doesn't cry the way people expect grief to look. She laughs, once, softly, and presses the back of her hand to her mouth. 41 years, she says. 41 years I thought I was the only one keeping a secret in that house. She looks up. He was kind to me every single day of it. I always thought it was habit. It was never habit. It was this. She taps the letter. It was this the entire time. 3 people in this house each decided, alone, that the kindest thing they could do for someone they loved was carry a truth in silence rather than hand it over. None of them discovered, until it was far too late to change anything, that the other 2 had made the identical choice, for the identical reason, at the identical time. That is what this story reveals about human nature. We tell ourselves silence is something we choose for the people we love, an act of protection. More often, it is simply the most bearable way to carry a truth we don't yet know how to survive saying out loud. And it does not stay contained. It moves quietly from one person to the next, inherited by whoever is standing closest, until someone, decades later, finally opens the right drawer. We tell ourselves silence is protection. It is only ever postponement, and it is never only ours to carry.